These are the notes on the last slide that we looked at, slide number 10. So connective tissue contains these three components: specialized cells, a ground substance, which is a non-cellular material. It can be fluid or syrupy, or it can be even like cement-like, as in the ground substance you find in bone tissue. Then there are protein fibers, and you're either going to find one of these fiber types or a combination of all three, but these are the three fiber types that are produced in connective tissue matrix. So collagen fibers provide strength and flexibility. Reticular fibers are highly branched, very thin collagen fibers. You find reticular fibers in some of the organs that are kind of solid, they're like solid and mushy all the way through. They don't have an opening inside them. For example, the spleen, the liver, the kidney, lymph nodes, all of these are composed of reticular tissue. Elastic fibers contain the protein elastin, and they are more for elasticity and flexibility than what collagen is. So when you put the ground substance and the fibers together, that is the matrix of connective tissue. There are three major categories of connective tissue. There's fibrous, supportive, and fluid. For the fibrous connective tissue, there are loose and dense fibrous connective tissue. Loose fibrous connective tissue has a lot of space between the components. You find this beneath the skin. The layer below the skin called the hypodermis contains loose fibrous connective tissue called areolar tissue, and it also contains adipose tissue, which is fat tissue. And then there's dense fibrous connective tissue, which is has fibers that are arranged closer together. It's more densely packed with fibers. We have dense fibrous connective tissue in the dermis of the skin. Gives our skin strength and flexibility. And also tendons, which connect muscles to bone. And ligaments that connect bone to bone are composed of dense fibrous connective tissue. Cartilage, in this case hyaline cartilage, which lines the ends of bones when they come together at a joint. This is showing you the upper arm bone called the humerus, and the cartilage tissue that lines the head of the humerus as it meets up with the scapula and forms the shoulder joint. So the ends of bones that meet at a joint are covered with cartilage. Also the nose, the ears, are composed of cartilage tissue. The disc in between our vertebrae, our ribs are connected to the sternum by cartilage. So cartilage and bone are supportive connective tissues. I'm sorry, I keep saying supportive. I mean structural. No, it does say supportive here. They both start with an S, and it depends on which class I'm teaching. In Bio 112, they're called bone and cartilage are the supportive connective tissue. So cartilage and bone supportive, and they're also, the matrix is more solid in those. Here are the notes for fibrous connective tissue. Fibrous connective tissue is dominated by these cells called fibroblast, and the word part blast means that it creates. So fibroblasts create the different protein fibers. And the fibrous connective tissue have a jelly-like matrix that contains collagen and elastic fibers. The loose fibrous connective tissue allows organs to expand. It supports epithelial tissue. It forms the protective covering over internal organs. And adipose tissue stores energy and insulates the body and provides padding. So adipose tissue is fat tissue. Dense fibrous connective tissue is very strong. We do have a layer of our skin that's composed of dense fibrous connective tissue, and then tendons, which connect muscle to bone, and ligaments, which connect bones to bones, are composed of dense fibrous connective tissue. Cartilage is classified according to the type of collagen and elastic fibers found in the matrix. So we've already looked at hyaline cartilage, but we also have elastic cartilage, like you find in the forming our outer ear. It's very bendy. And then fibrocartilage is a lot tougher. The intervertebral disc, the disc that you find between the vertebrae, those are composed of fibrocartilage. The cells of cartilage lie in small chambers called lacunae, and then they're surrounded by matrix. Cartilage does not have a direct blood supply, and therefore it heals very slowly. Bone is different. Bone does have an extensive blood supply, and so it's more easily able to heal if it's broken. The matrix of bone is an inorganic salt called calcium carbonate, deposited around protein fibers, cartilage mostly. I'm sorry, collagen. Collagen is the protein fiber that you find in bone. The bone cells are also located in lacunae and then surrounded by bone matrix. And the lacunae are arranged in concentric circles, like an onion, within bone units called osteons. And then in the center of those osteons would be a central canal that blood vessels travel through. So if we go back, there should be a picture right here. Here's an image. Here's the osteocyte or bone cell. All of these little dark shaped structures, these are osteocytes or bone cells. The entire unit is called an osteon. And it runs down the bone tissue like a straw. You know, it's a cylinder like a straw, except that instead of the walls are much thicker than the walls of a straw. And the inside, the canal here, is where the blood vessels run through. And you can see the layers of bone matrix. They're called lamellae. There are also these little tubes, little canals that run through from the cells to the blood vessels. They're called canaliculi, and they enable the nutrients and oxygen to get to those bone cells, because otherwise they're surrounded by bone matrix, and where they reside is just this little tiny space called a lacunae. So the only way they can stay alive is to have some kind of connection to the blood supply. So we have two types of bone. Bone, let's just, hold on. Okay, here's where we were. First, for the types of cartilage, there's hyaline cartilage. We find that in the nose and at the ends of long bones and in the ribs, connecting the ribs to the sternum or breastbone. Elastic cartilage, framework of the outer ear. Fibrocartilage in the pads between the vertebrae and our backbone. Call them intervertebral disc. Bone matrix is composed of calcium salts, which gives it hardness, and collagen fibers, which gives it strength, but also flexibility. There are two types of bone. There's compact bone, which makes up the shaft of long bones, like the arm bones and leg bones. The compact bone is composed of units called osteons, like what we just looked at. The osteons have blood vessels running through a central canal that carry nutrients to the bone cells. But a lot of our bone is spongy bone, and it consists of bone tissue that's arranged into bony bars and plates separated by air spaces, but there's red bone marrow that fills those air spaces. But the purpose of the spongy bone is to keep our skeleton from being so heavy. Then we have fluid connective tissue, which is blood and lymph. You do not have the fibers in fluid connective tissue, but you do have the matrix, and the matrix is the fluid part. You have cells that are surrounded by a fluid. So in blood, the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets are surrounded by plasma. So the plasma would be the fluid matrix of blood. Lymph is a fluid connective tissue that's located within our lymphatic vessels, and it contains white blood cells, and then the tissue called lymph is the matrix. And this shows you an image of blood that has been centrifuged so that all of the heavy particles fall to the bottom. So the plasma is this layer on top. The white blood cells form this very thin layer between the red blood cells and the plasma. And here's a picture of red blood cells and what they look like. The white blood cells are much larger and they stain purple. Their nuclei, the nuclei of white blood cells can have many lobes and have different shapes. And platelets are just fragments of cells, and they function in blood clotting. All right, moving on to, we've covered our epithelial and connective tissue, so we're going to move on to muscle tissue. Muscle tissue is designed for contraction. So muscle tissue consists of contractile cells containing actin and myosin filaments. And the actin and myosin filaments move past each other when the muscle cells contract. Muscle cells are actually called muscle fibers because they're very long. There are 3 types of muscle tissue. Our skeletal muscles are the ones that are connected to our bones and allow us to move. Skeletal muscles are the longest, have the longest muscle fibers. They are voluntary. We have voluntary control of the skeletal muscle contractions. And the fibers of skeletal muscle are striated. They produce these different dark and white banding pattern in them due to the arrangement of the actin and myosin filaments. And they are multinucleated. Many nuclei per muscle fiber. Smooth muscle or visceral muscle is found lining your blood vessels, your arteries, and even a very thin layer of smooth muscle in your larger veins, in your airways, in your intestines, lining tubes in your body that push fluids or air or even solids along. That's going to be smooth muscle. And that muscle is involuntary. We don't consciously control the contractions of those smooth muscles, and not striated. Cardiac muscle is striated but involuntary. So one thing about cardiac muscle is that the cells are bound to each other by intercalated disc, and they have a single nucleus, but the muscle fibers in cardiac muscle tissue are branching. This is what they look like. This is what a skeletal muscle fiber looks like. You can see the striations. Cardiac muscle also has striations, and then smooth muscle does not. All right, for nervous tissue, it is specialized to conduct electrical impulses. Nerve cells are called neurons. A neuron consists of dendrites, which are branching extensions from the cell body that receive information, receive impulses, and then an axon, which is the nerve, the part of the neuron that transmits impulses to a target organ or a target cell or a gland. So axons surrounded by myelin sheaths, which are like insulation, are what we call nerve fibers. And outside the brain and the spinal cord, fibers bound by connective tissue form nerves. So axons bound by connective tissue form our nerves. Neuroglia are the cells that support and nourish the neurons. In the brain, there's microglia for defense. They're phagocytes that engulf like bacteria and other pathogens. There are astrocytes that form the blood-brain barrier. Oligodendrocytes that form the myelin sheaths around axons. And outside the brain, you have Schwann cells that do the same thing as oligodendrocytes do inside the brain. And ependymal cells form and circulate cerebrospinal fluid. So all you really need to know for any exam question would be neuroglia are the support and nourish the neurons in nervous tissue. Here's a picture of a neuron. You can see the cell body, the dendrites that receive signals, take the signals to the cell body, and then the axons surrounded by myelin that transmits the electrical impulse to some target.